July 13th, 1943. Somewhere in the Solomon Islands. The candle had burned down to a stub. Lieutenant Hiroshi Ura's hand, steady despite the distant thunder of artillery, pressed his pen to paper one final time. Around him, the bunker walls leaked moisture. Outside, men who could still stand prepared positions they knew wouldn't hold. But Ura wasn't writing orders. He wasn't composing final letters home. He was writing the truth no commanding officer wanted documented. His diary, recovered weeks later by American intelligence teams and immediately classified, contained something more dangerous than tactical secrets. It contained a realization that undermined the entire narrative both sides had constructed about how wars are won. What Lieutenant Ura had witnessed in those final weeks wasn't a failure of courage. It wasn't even a failure of tactics. It was the collision between two philosophies of warfare, one that believed willpower could overcome any obstacle, and one that understood wars are won in supply depots, field hospitals, and coordination rooms long before the first shot is fired. The diary would remain sealed for decades, because what Ura described with brutal clarity was that courage cannot defeat systems, that bravery, no matter how absolute, cannot conjure ammunition across hostile seas, that the samurai spirit his commanders invoked so reverently was being methodically dismantled not by American aggression but by American organization. But to understand how Ura reached this conclusion, we need to go back to a beach that looked nothing like a battlefield. In the soft light of early morning, 4 American soldiers stood along a white sand shoreline. Palm trees curved overhead. The water stretched calm and blue toward the horizon. Their rifles rested casually. Their expressions showed neither triumph nor bloodlust, just the professional calm of men who trusted the machinery behind them. This wasn't the chaos of Guadalcanal. This wasn't the desperate fury of island assaults depicted in propaganda. This was something far more dangerous to Ura's platoon. This was the quiet efficiency of a system landing on schedule, supplied on schedule, advancing on schedule. Miles inland, Ura couldn't see these particular soldiers, but he could feel the weight of what they represented. Thousands like them, each one a single gear in a machine that stretched across oceans, powered by factories, hospitals, ships, and an infrastructure that treated logistics as seriously as heroism. The contrast between that peaceful beach and the collapse unfolding in Ura's jungle position tells the real story of the Pacific War. Not the story of cowards versus heroes, not even the story of good versus evil, the story of systems versus slogans. The seeds of Lieutenant Ura's final diary entry were planted months before, when his platoon was first transferred from the relative quiet of New Ireland to the increasingly desperate battlefront in the Solomons. His orders seemed straightforward: reinforce defensive lines and hold as long as possible against British-supported Allied forces pushing northward. But what Ura and his men were walking into wasn't a battle they could win through courage alone. It was a systematic dismantling that had already begun, one that would teach a Japanese officer trained in the warrior tradition a brutal lesson about modern warfare. A lesson he would write down in candlelight, knowing no one in his chain of command wanted to hear it. The men arrived already tired. They came by barge in late April, 43 soldiers who'd been promised a strategic repositioning, but understood the euphemism for what it was. They were being fed into a gap nobody else wanted to fill. The Solomon Islands campaign had turned into a grinding war of attrition, with British-supported Allied forces methodically island-hopping northward, while Japanese defensive positions withered from lack of reinforcement. Ura's platoon landed at a muddy inlet under cover of darkness. No welcoming committee, no established supply line, just a set of coordinates and orders to dig in along a ridge overlooking what intelligence optimistically called a strategic waterway. In reality, it was a narrow channel choked with mangroves, valuable only because it offered one of the few approaches inland that wouldn't require hacking through pure jungle. The first night they worked in silence. Entrenching tools bit into volcanic soil. Private Nakamura, a former schoolteacher from Hokkaido, organized the men into efficient teams without being asked. Corporal Hayashi, the platoon's de facto engineer, surveyed sightlines and nodded with cautious approval. Sergeant Kimura, oldest among them at 34, moved between positions, offering quiet corrections in the patient tone of a man who'd survived China and knew the difference between parade ground discipline and survival. By dawn, they had the skeleton of a defensive network. Firing pits connected by shallow trenches, observation posts marked with stripped branches, fields of fire cleared just enough to matter. It wasn't impressive, but it had the illusion of purpose. "We'll make them pay for every metre," Kimura said, surveying their work. The men nodded, wanting to believe him. For the first week, that optimism held. They improved positions daily. Nakamura started evening literacy sessions for the younger conscripts, reading from a water-stained poetry collection he'd carried from home. Hayashi rigged a rainwater collection system using salvaged tarps. Private Tanaka, barely 19, showed unexpected talent for camouflage work, weaving palm fronds into screens that looked like natural growth. Yura observed these rituals with something between pride and unease. His men were trying to build normalcy in a place that permitted none. They spoke often of duty, of protecting the homeland by holding this remote ridge, of the honour inherent in their sacrifice. These weren't empty words. They believed them with the sincerity of men raised in a culture where such beliefs were woven into identity itself. But Ura had studied at the military academy. He'd read not just Japanese doctrine, but translated British and American military theory. He understood something his men didn't yet grasp. Willpower without logistics was a death sentence, wearing a patriotic mask. The first crack appeared on May 8th. A supply runner arrived with a manifest showing 30 crates expected. He delivered 11. The rest, he explained with exhausted apology, had been lost when American aircraft strafed the convoy. 3 barges turned back. 1 sank. What remained had been distributed across 5 positions, each one screaming for priority. Ura examined the delivered crates methodically. Rice bags swollen with seawater contamination, ammunition corroded from saltwater exposure, medical supplies reduced to basic bandages and iodine, no quinine, no sulfur drugs, no morphine. The manifest promised replacement delivery within 10 days. 10 days became 3 weeks, then 5. "We can stretch what we have," Kimura assured him. "The men are disciplined. They understand sacrifice." They did understand sacrifice. What they didn't understand, what Ura was only beginning to fully comprehend, was that sacrifice without logistical support wasn't noble. It was simply waste. The mosquitoes arrived with the heavy rains in late May. At first, the men joked about the insects. Tanaka claimed they were larger than the bombers overhead. Nakamura composed haiku about their persistence, but within a week, the jokes stopped. Private Watanabe was first. He complained of chills during the morning inspection, then collapsed during afternoon watch. By evening, he was delirious with fever. The platoon medic, a quiet, methodical man named Ito, did what he could with cool compresses and rationed water. But without quinine, malaria followed its inevitable course. Fever, delirium, convulsions, death. Watanabe died on June 2nd, begging for his mother in a voice that hadn't yet finished changing. He wasn't the last. By mid-June, 8 men were too sick to stand watch. Ito moved between them with decreasing hope, his medical kit reduced to comfort measures. He'd requested quinine through proper channels 3 times. Each request received the same response: supplies en route, maintain position, demonstrate the offensive spirit. "Offensive spirit doesn't cure malaria," Ito said quietly one night, speaking only to Ura. "They're sending us slogans instead of medicine." It was the most openly critical statement Ura had heard from any of his men. He didn't reprimand Ito. He couldn't, because Ito was right. Meanwhile, intelligence reports filtering up from command painted a picture that contradicted everything the slogans promised. The British and Americans weren't charging recklessly into Japanese positions. They were advancing with mechanical precision, engineers clearing paths, artillery softening positions according to coordinated schedules, supply lines moving forward in lockstep with frontline troops. One report described an American field hospital established just 8 miles behind their advancing line, complete with surgical capacity and refrigerated blood storage. 8 miles. Ura's nearest field hospital was 40 miles away, accessible only by paths that barely qualified as trails. Another report detailed Allied artillery patterns. Rolling barrages timed to the minute, coordinated with aerial reconnaissance, adjusted in real time based on spotter feedback. This wasn't warfare as Ura had been taught, the glorious clash of spirits, the triumph of will over adversity. This was industrial process applied to human destruction. His superiors responded to these reports with the same refrains. The enemy lacks our fighting spirit. 1 Japanese soldier equals 10 Americans. Victory comes through unwavering resolve. Ura stopped attending the weekly officers' briefings. The disconnect between rhetoric and reality had become unbearable. In early July, Corporal Hayashi approached him after evening inspection. "Lieutenant, the men are asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About why we see American planes daily but never our own. About why their artillery falls on schedule but ours has gone silent. About why we're told to hold positions we can't possibly defend." Hayashi paused. "They're not complaining, sir. They're trying to understand." Ura had no answers that wouldn't sound like the same empty slogans his commanders repeated. So he told them what he could, that their duty was clear, that they were buying time for other operations, that their sacrifice mattered. The lies tasted like ash, but the truth would have broken them. On July 9th, Sergeant Kimura sat beside Ura during the evening meal, thin rice with foraged greens. "We're down to half strength," Kimura said. "Between malaria and dysentery, I have maybe 20 men who can effectively fight." "I know. How long are we expected to hold?" Ura looked at his sergeant, this steady, capable man who'd survived campaigns through sheer competence and will, and recognized the question beneath the question. "How long until we're sacrificed for nothing?" "As long as necessary," Ura said, the official answer reflexive. Kimura nodded slowly. He didn't press further, but his eyes held a knowledge that needed no words. They were already ghosts, waiting for the system that had abandoned them to finally acknowledge their death. The artillery started at 600 on July 10th. Not a furious bombardment, not the chaotic rage of desperate men. The shells fell in measured intervals, one every 40 seconds, walking methodically across the jungle in a grid pattern that suggested maps, calculations, and somebody timing each salvo with a stopwatch. Ura crouched in his command post, counting the intervals. 40 seconds, 40 seconds, 40 seconds. The precision was more terrifying than random violence. This wasn't anger, this was procedure. By 0630, the bombardment shifted westward by exactly 200 meters. Ura checked his watch. The pattern would continue, he realized, until every suspected position within a kilometer had been systematically processed. Not destroyed necessarily, just degraded, catalogued, prepared for the infantry patrols that would follow. They're not fighting us. They're erasing terrain. His diary entry that morning was brief. "The enemy operates like factory workers. We operate like samurai poets. These philosophies cannot coexist on the same battlefield." The Allied patrols appeared that afternoon. Kimura spotted them first, 6 men moving through the jungle with neither haste nor hesitation. They advanced in bounds, 3 men covering while 3 moved, then rotating. When they reached uncertain terrain, they stopped completely and waited for instructions that apparently came via radio, because twice Ura watched them adjust their route based on no visible cue. "They're not even looking for us," Hayashi whispered from the observation post. "They're just checking boxes." He was right. The patrol reached a marked grid coordinate, established a temporary position, observed for 15 minutes, then withdrew along a different route. Professional, systematic, utterly devoid of the reckless aggression Japanese doctrine insisted Americans possessed. That night, Ura wrote, "We were taught the enemy charges blindly, drunk on materialism and cowardice. Instead, they advance like surveyors, measuring death in increments we cannot counter. Their discipline exceeds ours because it's built on supply lines, not slogans." The jungle itself was turning against them. Private Tanaka, the talented camouflage artist, collapsed during morning watch on July 11th. Ito examined him with hands that had learned to diagnose without adequate tools. Advanced dysentery, dehydration, malnutrition. He looked at Ura with hollow eyes. "I have nothing to treat him with. Not even clean water anymore." The rainwater collection system Hayashi had rigged was contaminated. They discovered that too late, after half the remaining men developed stomach ailments. The river was 2 kilometers away through exposed terrain that Allied patrols now crossed daily. Sending men for water meant risking ambush. Not sending them meant watching the platoon die of thirst. Ura chose the risk. He sent Nakamura with 3 men at dusk. They returned with half-filled canteens and a bullet wound in Private Sato's shoulder. They'd encountered an American patrol at the river, not a firefight, just an exchange of shots before both groups withdrew. But Sato's wound was infected within hours. Ito had no sulfur powder, no antibiotics, just iodine that made Sato scream and did nothing to stop the sepsis. Sato died 2 days later, whispering apologies for failing his duty. "He didn't fail anything," Ito said, cleaning his inadequate medical kit. With shaking hands. "We failed him. Command failed him. This entire system failed him." Ura didn't reprimand the insubordination. Ito was simply stating facts. The mathematics of collapse became undeniable. 23 men remained combat capable. Ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per rifle. Food had been reduced to 1 meal daily. Rice stretched with grass and bark that provided bulk but no nutrition. The radio had died completely after the last battery failed. They were cut off not just from supplies but from any illusion of being part of a larger operation. Meanwhile, the Allied advance continued with metronomic consistency. Artillery at dawn. Patrols by afternoon, occasional aircraft overhead, observers marking coordinates. At night, Ura could hear construction sounds from the coast, the rhythmic hammering and mechanical drone of engineers building roads, establishing depots, creating infrastructure that would support the next phase of advancement. His diary entries grew more analytical, almost detached. July 11th. Observed enemy supply convoy, 12 trucks, organised intervals, armed escort. Our last supply delivery was 34 days ago, arrived by damaged barge. We cannot win a war of attrition when only one side is being supplied. July 12th, morning. Counted 47 Allied aircraft sorties today. Have not seen Japanese aircraft in 19 days. Air superiority is not a matter of courage. It is a matter of fuel, maintenance, replacement parts, and trained pilots held in reserve. We have slogans about the divine wind. They have maintenance schedules. The psychological deterioration manifested in small ruptures. Private Yoshida, normally disciplined, began talking to himself during watch. Corporal Hayashi snapped at Nakamura over a trivial matter, then apologized repeatedly with tears streaming down his fever-flushed face. Kimura moved through daily routines with mechanical precision, but his eyes had acquired a distant quality, as if he'd already accepted being dead and was merely waiting for his body to acknowledge the fact. Nakamura still conducted evening sessions, but the poetry had stopped. Now he just sat with the younger men, saying nothing, offering presence as the only comfort remaining. Ura found himself returning obsessively to a single realization, writing variations of it across multiple diary entries. Courage is not the variable that determines modern warfare. My men possess courage in abundance, more than the enemy perhaps, but courage cannot substitute for organization. Bravery does not transport ammunition. Fighting spirit does not cure malaria. The samurai ethic we've elevated to religious doctrine is being systematically defeated by men who understand that war is logistics, medicine, communication, and industrial capacity. We are not losing because we lack fighting spirit. We are losing because fighting spirit is no longer sufficient. The moment of complete understanding came on the evening of July 12th. Ura sat in his command post, looking at his remaining men. Kimura, organising the final ammunition with ritualistic care. Ito sitting beside patients he could no longer help. Nakamura writing letters for men too weak to hold pens. Hayashi reinforcing positions everyone knew wouldn't hold. Brave men, disciplined men, men who'd done everything asked of them and more. And it didn't matter. Because 20 kilometres away, Allied forces were advancing on schedule, supplied on schedule, supported by artillery that fired on schedule, backed by hospitals and depots and replacement troops that arrived on schedule. They were part of a system that treated soldiers as valuable assets to be maintained, not as expendable manifestations of national will. His final diary entry before the order arrived was the clearest. We were sent to hold a position with courage. They came to take it with systems. There was never any question how this would end. At 2100 hours, a runner stumbled into camp, the first contact from command in 11 days. He carried a single folded paper. Ura read the message twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his diary. The order was simple. Hold for 48 hours. Reinforcements would exploit the delay. Both sentences were lies and Ura knew it. They were being spent like currency, buying time they'd never lived to see used. Ura didn't sleep that night. He sat in the command post with the order spread before him, reading it by candlelight as if repetition might change its meaning. Hold for 48 hours. Reinforcements will exploit the delay. The paper felt obscene in its brevity. 2 sentences to announce the death of 23 men. The runner who delivered it had already collapsed from exhaustion. Ito examined him briefly, then shook his head. Severe dehydration, infected foot wound. He won't make it back even if we sent him. Then he stays, Ura said quietly. At dawn, he gathered the men who could still stand, 15 of them, counting himself. The others lay in the medical area where Ito maintained the fiction of treatment. Kimura stood at attention despite the fever that made him sway. Nakamura leaned on his rifle. Hayashi's hands trembled constantly now. Malaria or exhaustion, perhaps both. Ura kept his voice steady. We've received orders to hold this position for 48 hours. Command requires time to organize reinforcements for the next phase of operations. He watched their faces. They were too experienced, too depleted to believe the lie. But they nodded anyway because acknowledging the truth meant confronting something worse than death. The knowledge that their sacrifice was administrative rather than strategic. "We'll do our duty, Lieutenant," Kimura said. The other men echoed him, their voices thin but sincere. Ura dismissed them to prepare positions, then returned to his post and vomited quietly into the corner. The ammunition inventory took an hour. Kimura spread everything across a tarp with the methodical care of a man creating a shrine. 147 rifle rounds, 32 grenades, though 6 were corroded and unreliable. 400 rounds for the Type 96 machine gun, 2 smoke canisters, 3 signal flares that hadn't been fired because there was nobody left to signal. "If we're disciplined," Kimura said, doing calculations in his head, "we can make this last through the first assault, maybe into the second if they're cautious." "And then?" Hayashi asked. Kimura didn't answer. There was no third assault to plan for. They distributed the ammunition in silence. 10 rounds per rifle. Grenades to men whose hands were steady enough to throw them. The machine gun positioned to cover the most likely approach, with Corporal Hayashi designated as gunner despite his tremors. "I can still shoot straight," Hayashi insisted when Ura questioned the assignment. "Let me be useful." That afternoon, Nakamura approached Ura with a stack of letters. "The men asked if I'd write for those who can't hold pens anymore," he explained. "I told them I would." The letters were brief, formal, constructed from phrases that had been repeated across 10,000 deathbeds. "I served with honor. I thought of you at the end. Please tell my mother I was brave." Nakamura read each one aloud for approval before sealing them in whatever scraps of waterproof material could be found. Private Yoshida dictated a letter to his younger brother. "Do not become a soldier. Become an engineer. The future belongs to men who build systems, not men who die for slogans." Ura approved it without comment. That evening they shared what remained of their food. Ito had hoarded a small reserve for the bedridden, but he distributed it now. There was no point saving it. Thin rice wrapped in wilted leaves, a few pieces of dried fish someone had kept hidden, bark tea that provided warmth but no nutrition. They ate slowly, sitting in small groups. Nobody spoke much. Tanaka, delirious with fever, sang a children's song about catching fireflies. Kimura sat beside him, holding his hand until the singing stopped. Private Suda, barely 17, asked Nakamura if he thought the British would treat prisoners fairly. "Yes," Nakamura said without hesitation. "How do you know?" "Because they're running a system, not a vendetta. Systems require accountability." Ura listened from the edge of the circle. Nakamura was offering the boy a lie, but it was a kind one. The truth that surrendering would likely mean execution by their own officers if they survived the battle served no purpose now. After the meal, Kimura approached Ura privately. "The men know this is the end," he said. "They're not fools, but they're trying to believe it means something." "Does it?" Ura asked. Kimura was silent for a long moment. "It means we kept faith with each other. That's not nothing." "It should be more than that." "Should be, yes." Kimura looked toward the men settling into their positions. "But should be and is stopped, aligning weeks ago." At midnight, Ura opened his diary for the last time. His hand was steady. The candle cast shadows across pages filled with observations, calculations, and the slow documentation of systematic collapse. He'd started this journal as a tactical record. It had become something else, evidence for a trial that would never occur. He wrote slowly, choosing each word with the precision of a man who understood this would be his final testimony. July 30th, 1943. We have been ordered to hold for 48 hours. There will be no reinforcements. There will be no relief. This is not a tactical order. It is an administrative decision to convert our lives into time, purchasing hours for operations we will never see. My men possess courage beyond measure. They have endured starvation, disease, abandonment, and the knowledge of their own approaching deaths without breaking discipline. They are everything our doctrine claims to value: loyal, brave, willing to sacrifice without hesitation. But courage is not currency in modern warfare. It cannot be exchanged for ammunition, medicine, or the supply chains that determine victory. The British and Americans do not fight with greater bravery. They fight with greater organisation. Their soldiers are sustained by systems we never built, hospitals that move with their lines, supply chains that function across oceans, artillery coordinated by radios we cannot jam, air superiority maintained by maintenance crews and replacement parts. We were sent to hold ground with willpower. They came to take it with logistics. There is no contest between these philosophies. One is poetry, the other is mathematics. On this battlefield, mathematics wins. I do not fault my men. I fault the doctrine that taught us courage alone could prevail. I fault the commanders who sent us to remote islands with slogans instead of supplies. I fault the system that treats soldiers as manifestations of national will rather than human beings requiring food, medicine, and support. Tomorrow we will fight because we have been ordered to fight. We will die because we were always going to die. The decision was made the moment we landed without adequate supplies, without air support, without any genuine plan for reinforcement. If anyone reads this, understand that we did not fail. The system that sent us here failed, and it will continue to fail until courage is matched with organisation, until bravery is supported by logistics, until we learn that wars are won in supply depots before they are won on battlefields. My men deserved better than poetry. They deserved systems. He closed the diary and wrapped it in oilcloth, tucking it into a tin container he'd prepared. Tomorrow, when the Allied forces overran their position, perhaps an intelligence officer would find it. Perhaps someone would read it and understand. Probably not, but he'd written the truth anyway. Outside, Kimura was checking positions one final time. Hayashi sat beside the machine. Gun, hands wrapped around the grips to stop them shaking. Nakamura stared at the jungle, possibly praying, possibly just remembering what life had felt like before this. Ura looked at his watch. 47 hours remaining. The count had already begun. The end came faster than anyone expected. At 5:45 on July 14th, Allied artillery began the preparatory bombardment. Not the measured, methodical salvos Ura had grown accustomed to, but concentrated fire that suggested the reconnaissance patrols had finally mapped every position with precision. Shells fell in patterns that indicated coordination between ground observers, aerial reconnaissance, and fire control centres operating miles away. Ura's men crouched in their positions while the jungle disintegrated around them. Trees shattered, earth fountained upward. The carefully constructed firing pits that had taken weeks to build were erased in minutes. The barrage lasted 18 minutes. Then silence. Kimura emerged from his dugout, checking on positions. 3 men were dead from direct hits. 5 more were too wounded or deafened to fight. The machine gun had been buried under a collapsed tree. Hayashi was trying to dig it out with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Contact!" someone shouted. They came through the smoke in organised lines, not charging, not rushing, just advancing with the steady confidence of men who knew the outcome was decided. 2 platoons, maybe 3. They moved in bounds, covering each other, communicating with hand signals Ura recognised from translated manuals he'd studied at the academy. His remaining men opened fire. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Ura fired his pistol at shapes moving through the smoke until the slide locked back on an empty magazine. Beside him, Nakamura worked his rifle methodically until he collapsed from a wound Ura hadn't seen him take. Kimura threw his final grenade, then picked up a fallen rifle and kept shooting. Then the Americans were in the trenches, and it was over. Ura raised his hands. Around him, the 5 men still capable of surrender did the same. The Americans secured them with professional efficiency, searched for weapons, checked for injuries, called for medics via radio. One American soldier, noticing Ura's rank insignia, pointed to the command post. 2 others searched it thoroughly, emerging with maps, papers, and a tin container wrapped in oilcloth. The diary would travel to a different war than the one Ura had fought. First Lieutenant James Morrison, U.S. Army Intelligence, opened the diary 3 days later at a field analysis station 8 miles inland. The position occupied the same beachhead that had appeared so peaceful in the early morning light weeks before. White sand, curved palms, calm water. Now it hosted tents, communication equipment, supply depots, and a medical station where captured Japanese soldiers received the same treatment as American wounded. Morrison read slowly, his Japanese adequate but requiring concentration. As he progressed through Ura's entries, his expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching discomfort. "What have you got?" his colleague, Captain Williams, asked. "A Japanese officer's diary, but it's not what we usually see." Morrison flipped back through pages. No fanaticism, no emperor worship, just logistics analysis. He's critiquing his own supply system, comparing it to ours. Williams leaned over. "Intelligence value. Tactically, nothing we don't already know, but strategically..." Morrison paused on the final entry. He understood exactly why they were losing. Systems versus spirit. He wrote it like a goddamn after-action report. "So what do we do with it?" Morrison closed the diary carefully. "Send it up the chain. Someone at War College might find it interesting." The diary spent the next 2 years moving through various intelligence offices before landing on the desk of a post-war military analyst at the Pentagon. Major Robert Chen, tasked with compiling lessons learned from the Pacific Campaign, read it in a single sitting. He immediately flagged it for inclusion in his classified report on asymmetric doctrine failures. The post-war analysis would validate everything Ura had written in that bunker. Studies showed that Japanese frontline units in the latter stages of the Pacific War suffered casualty rates exceeding 90%, not primarily from combat but from disease, starvation, and systemic collapse. Meanwhile, Allied casualty rates declined as logistical systems improved, medical care advanced, and supply chains became more efficient. The asymmetry was stark. American forces in the Pacific were supported by 200 ships dedicated solely to logistics, 300 field hospitals, and supply lines that could deliver blood plasma to frontline aid stations within hours. Japanese forces relied on supply routes that functioned sporadically, medical systems overwhelmed from the war's beginning, and a doctrine that explicitly valued spiritual strength over material support. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping strategy succeeded not because American soldiers were braver than Japanese soldiers, but because American logistics could sustain advances, while Japanese logistics could not sustain defense. Every island taken became a node in an expanding network of airfields, ports, hospitals, and supply depots. Each Japanese position cut off became an isolated cell, slowly starved of everything except orders to hold. Major Chen's report, declassified decades later, included extensive excerpts from Ura's diary. His conclusion echoed Ura's own. The Pacific War demonstrated that modern industrial warfare rewards organization over courage. The Japanese emphasis on fighting spirit, while producing individually brave and capable soldiers, could not compensate for systemic failures in logistics, medical support, and adaptive planning. By contrast, Allied success stemmed from treating warfare as a complex system requiring coordination across supply, medical, communication, and tactical domains. Lieutenant Ura's observations, written under conditions of extreme duress, display remarkable analytical clarity. His recognition that courage is not currency in modern warfare represents a fundamental truth that many military theorists failed to grasp until far later. The diary itself was preserved in military archives, occasionally cited in staff college lectures on logistics and doctrine. Ura's name appeared in footnotes, his insights stripped of context, his death reduced to data points. He had been right about everything except one thing. Someone did read his diary and understand. They just understood too late to save him. The beach where American soldiers once stood in morning light is quiet again now. The temporary supply depots have long since been dismantled. The field hospitals moved forward with the advancing war, then disappeared entirely when peace came. The jungle has reclaimed most of the scars, though occasionally hikers find rusted debris from battles nobody remembers. Ura's position, the ridge he defended with men who deserve better, is unmarked. No monument identifies where courage collided with systems and lost. But the lesson remains, etched not in stone but in the doctrine of every modern military. Wars are won by the invisible architecture of support before they're won by visible acts of bravery. Ammunition stockpiles matter more than warrior spirit. Hospital capacity saves more soldiers than heroic last stands. Communication networks decide battles more certainly than individual courage. Ura understood this in a bunker by candlelight, writing truth with hands that didn't shake even as his world collapsed. He understood that his men weren't failing. They were being failed. That courage without support is simply sacrifice rebranded as virtue. That sending soldiers to fight systems with slogans is not strategy, but murder dressed in patriotic language. The calm efficiency of those soldiers on the beach, rifles resting, expressions neutral, posture relaxed, represented something more powerful than aggression or bravery. They represented infrastructure, organization, the unglamorous machinery that keeps soldiers fed, healthy, supplied, and supported. Ura's platoon had courage in abundance. What they lacked were the systems that transform courage into victory rather than tragedy.